it's been a bit of a shock. However much one tries to prepare oneself for something like this, it's still a dreadful shock, and we're still trying to come to terms with that. And it's very, very sad. But I have to say that the extraordinary tributes.
Something about the atmosphere inside the royal household had changed, and those closest to the institution seemed to sense it long before the public noticed. What appeared at first to be a routine discussion about royal heirlooms gradually evolved into something far more significant, raising questions about loyalty, legacy, and the future direction of the monarchy itself. For decades, some of the most treasured jewels associated with the royal family have represented far more than wealth or ceremony. They have symbolized continuity, memory, and the passing of responsibility from one generation to the next. Yet according to reports circulating among royal observers, a decision connected to one senior royal figure has sparked intense speculation behind palace walls. At the center of that discussion stand Catherine, Princess of Wales, and Queen Camilla, two women whose roles within the monarchy continue to shape its modern identity in very different ways. The question is not simply who receives a collection of historic jewels. The larger question is what such a decision might reveal about trust, legacy, and the future image of the crown. And perhaps most intriguingly of all, why would a respected royal patriarch reportedly make a choice that many insiders never expected? Before we continue, let us know your thoughts. If you were responsible for preserving a centuries-old royal legacy, would you place those treasures with the present queen or with the future queen? Share your perspective in the comments below. For much of his life, Prince Edward, Duke of Edinburgh, has occupied a unique position within the royal family. Unlike some royals who regularly dominated newspaper headlines, Edward built a reputation through consistency rather than controversy. While public attention often focused on larger personalities and more dramatic royal developments, the Duke quietly carried out engagements, represented the crown, and maintained a steady presence within the institution. That reserved approach sometimes caused observers to underestimate his influence. Yet those who have followed royal affairs closely understand that senior royals often witness far more than they ever publicly acknowledge. They observe shifting alliances, changing priorities, and the subtle dynamics that rarely appear in official statements. In recent years, many commentators have suggested that the future of the monarchy has become increasingly connected to the popularity and public image of Catherine, Princess of Wales. From major state occasions to international engagements, Catherine has frequently emerged as one of the most admired members of the royal family. Her ability to balance tradition with modern expectations has led many royal watchers to view her as a central figure in the institution's long-term future. But that perception creates another question. If Catherine increasingly represents the monarchy's future, what happens when decisions involving royal heritage begin to reflect that reality? That question became even more intriguing following a series of public appearances in which the Princess of Wales demonstrated a remarkable sensitivity toward royal history. Whether wearing pieces associated with Queen Elizabeth II or selecting jewelry that once belonged to Diana, Princess of Wales, Catherine has often appeared conscious of the stories attached to those items. To many observers, she is not merely wearing royal jewels. She is continuing a narrative that stretches across generations. However, not everyone interprets those choices in the same way. Some commentators argue that jewelry within the monarchy carries unavoidable political symbolism. Every brooch, tiara, and necklace can become a statement about status, continuity, and influence. What appears to be a simple fashion choice may actually communicate something much larger to those familiar with royal tradition. That is where the current discussion becomes increasingly complicated. Reports suggest that conversations surrounding several historic pieces have quietly intensified behind palace walls. While official details remain limited, royal observers have pointed to growing speculation about where certain heirlooms may ultimately reside in the years ahead. At first glance, such discussions might seem insignificant. After all, the royal family possesses extensive collections accumulated across generations. Yet those who understand royal history know that specific pieces often carry emotional importance far beyond their financial value. They represent family memory, they represent institutional continuity, and sometimes they represent personal judgment. The possibility that a senior royal might deliberately direct historic jewels toward Catherine rather than elsewhere has therefore generated enormous curiosity among palace watchers. not because of the jewels themselves, but because of what such a decision could potentially signal. Would it reflect confidence in the Princess of Wales? Would it represent an effort to preserve a particular royal legacy? Or could it reveal deeper feelings that have remained hidden from public view for years? Those questions have only intensified as discussions surrounding royal succession continue to evolve. King Charles III remains at the center of the monarchy, yet increasing attention naturally focuses on Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and Catherine as the future king and future queen. Within that context, even a private decision about family heirlooms can suddenly take on national significance. And according to some royal commentators, one particular moment may have revealed far more than anyone initially realized. A quiet interaction, witnessed by only a handful of people, would soon become the subject of intense discussion among palace insiders. What was said during that exchange remains disputed, but the implications were powerful enough to reignite questions about loyalty, inheritance, and the future direction of the royal family. And as those questions began spreading through royal circles, it became increasingly clear that the story was no longer about jewels alone. Something much larger was beginning to emerge. The more palace observers examined the reports surrounding the Duke's apparent preference, the less the story seemed to be about jewelry, and the more it appeared to concern something the monarchy has always valued above almost everything else: continuity. Throughout royal history, the transfer of symbolic possessions has rarely been a simple family matter. Objects carry messages. They reveal priorities. Sometimes they even expose tensions that official statements prefer to leave unspoken. That is precisely why discussions surrounding these heirlooms began attracting attention far beyond the walls of royal residences. What made the situation particularly intriguing was the timing. The monarchy currently exists in a period of transition unlike any seen in decades. King Charles III occupies the throne, yet public conversation increasingly focuses on the future reign of Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and the role Catherine will ultimately play beside him. In many ways, two eras appear to be operating simultaneously. One represents the present institution. The other represents the institution people believe is approaching. That distinction may help explain why some royal commentators reacted so strongly to reports surrounding the Duke's alleged wishes. If a respected senior royal consciously chooses to align treasured family heirlooms with the future rather than the present, what message might that send? More importantly, was the decision motivated by personal affection, institutional calculation, or something far more complicated? Those questions became even more significant when analysts began examining a pattern that had received surprisingly little attention. Over the past several years, Catherine's public standing has steadily expanded beyond that of a senior working royal. She has increasingly become a symbol of stability during periods when the royal family faced intense scrutiny from multiple directions. During times when public confidence appeared uncertain, the Princess of Wales often emerged as one of the institution's most trusted figures. Polling trends, media coverage, and public reactions repeatedly suggested that audiences viewed her as someone capable of balancing modern expectations with traditional royal values. Yet that observation creates another layer of uncertainty. If public trust is becoming concentrated around certain individuals, does that inevitably alter internal perceptions of influence? Officially, royal hierarchy is determined by constitutional structure and succession. Unofficially, however, influence often operates through entirely different mechanisms. Respect cannot be granted by decree. Trust cannot be inherited through title alone. Both develop gradually over time, sometimes producing outcomes that even institutions struggle to predict. Several royal historians have noted that this phenomenon is not new. Throughout British royal history, certain figures have exercised influence far beyond their formal positions simply because they embodied qualities people believed the monarchy needed during a particular era. The question now is whether something similar may be occurring again. Observers who support this interpretation point to the growing symbolism attached to Catherine's role. Increasingly, discussions surrounding her public appearances focus not only on what she does, but on what she represents. Resilience, continuity, stability, service. These themes appear repeatedly whenever commentators discuss her place within the future of the crown. If that perception has also developed among senior members of the royal family, then decisions involving heritage, legacy, and preservation suddenly take on a different meaning. And that is where the story becomes more complicated, because some royal watchers believe the alleged inheritance discussion may reflect a larger concern that extends beyond any individual relationship. What if the real issue involves the future visibility of royal history itself? Many historic collections face a challenge that rarely receives public attention. Over time, family possessions can become fragmented. Items pass through generations. Estates are divided. Pieces disappear into private collections. Eventually, objects that once carried national significance become inaccessible to the public altogether. Several commentators have suggested that preserving visibility may be just as important as preserving ownership. From that perspective, directing historic heirlooms toward active senior royals could represent an effort to keep those pieces connected to public life rather than allowing them to gradually vanish from view. That possibility does not answer every question. In fact, it creates several new ones. Was the reported preference primarily about Catherine herself, or was she viewed as the most effective guardian of a broader legacy? Did personal admiration influence the decision, or did institutional considerations outweigh personal feelings entirely? The uncertainty surrounding those questions only intensified when royal analysts began discussing another factor that received surprisingly little attention: memory. Monarchies operate through tradition, but traditions survive because individuals choose to protect them. Every generation inherits responsibilities from the previous one, yet not every generation interprets those responsibilities in the same way. Differences emerge. Priorities shift. Expectations evolve. Senior royals who have witnessed multiple decades of change often develop perspectives unavailable to younger generations. They remember earlier crises, earlier successes, earlier mistakes. Some observers therefore wonder whether the Duke's reported position may have been shaped not only by present circumstances, but by memories accumulated across a lifetime spent watching the institution navigate periods of extraordinary turbulence. If so, the significance extends far beyond a collection of jewels. It becomes a judgment about legacy itself. And legacy has always been one of the monarchy's most powerful forces. The public often focuses on ceremonies, appearances, and announcements. Behind the scenes, however, another process unfolds continuously. Senior figures assess what should be preserved, what should evolve, and which individuals are best positioned to carry certain traditions forward. Those assessments rarely become public. When they do, even indirectly, they attract enormous attention. That may explain why the story continues generating discussion despite the limited amount of confirmed information available. The fascination is not driven by gemstones or precious metals. It is driven by what people believe the reported decision might reveal about confidence, trust, and the future direction of the royal family. And yet, just as observers began focusing on questions of legacy, another possibility emerged. Several royal commentators suggested that the most important development had not occurred during any inheritance discussion at all. Instead, they pointed toward a series of private conversations reportedly taking place among senior figures concerned about how future generations will interpret the monarchy's modern history. If those reports are accurate, then the debate surrounding these heirlooms may represent only the visible surface of a much larger conversation, one involving reputation, memory, and the long-term identity of the institution itself. And if that is true, then what appeared to be a personal decision may actually be connected to questions that reach far beyond any single royal household, raising uncertainties that could shape perceptions of the monarchy for years to come. If discussions surrounding the heirlooms were really about continuity rather than ownership, then another question immediately emerges. Why would continuity suddenly become such a pressing concern now? After all, royal institutions have spent centuries navigating succession, preserving traditions, and transferring responsibilities from one generation to another. Yet many analysts believe the monarchy is currently facing a uniquely delicate moment, one in which public perception may be influencing internal calculations more than at any point in recent memory. That possibility helps explain why so many observers began looking beyond the reported decision itself and toward the broader environment in which it allegedly occurred. The more closely they examine the timing, the more they notice that several separate developments appeared to be converging simultaneously. Questions about succession, questions about public confidence, questions about modernization, and questions about long-term stability were all unfolding at the same time. Individually, none of these developments appeared extraordinary. Taken together, however, they began forming a pattern. Royal commentators have often noted that institutions rarely make significant decisions in response to a single event. More often, choices emerge after years of accumulated observations. Small developments that seem unrelated gradually combine until they create a larger strategic reality. What appears sudden from the outside may actually represent the final stage of a much longer process. Some observers believe that may be exactly what happened here. If that interpretation is correct, then the reported preference toward Catherine was never intended as a reaction to a particular disagreement or isolated circumstance. Instead, it may have reflected years of observation regarding who was increasingly becoming central to the monarchy's future narrative. That distinction matters because narratives are powerful within royal institutions. Governments operate through policy. Businesses operate through performance. Monarchies, in many respects, operate through symbolism. Public trust depends not only on constitutional legitimacy, but also on the stories people associate with the institution itself. Those stories influence how each generation understands the crown's purpose. For decades, different royal figures have come to represent different chapters of that story. Some became associated with duty, others became associated with change, others became associated with resilience during periods of uncertainty. What analysts increasingly noticed was that Catherine's public image seemed to combine several of those qualities at once. She represented continuity without appearing outdated, tradition without appearing disconnected, stability without appearing rigid. Whether fair or not, that perception carried implications far beyond individual popularity. Because popularity can rise and fall, symbolic importance is far more enduring. This may explain why certain royal historians began drawing comparisons to earlier periods when institutions quietly invested symbolic weight in individuals long before their formal position changed. Not because succession was in doubt, but because public expectations were already evolving. Those comparisons are not important because history repeats itself exactly. They matter because they reveal how royal institutions often prepare for future transitions years before those transitions officially arrive. And that raises a fascinating possibility. What if the reported inheritance discussion was less about today's monarchy than tomorrow's? Some analysts have suggested that senior royals often think in terms of decades rather than months. Their perspective extends beyond immediate headlines toward future anniversaries, future reigns, and future public perceptions. Decisions that seem small in the present can appear highly significant when viewed across generations. If that is true, then preserving certain heirlooms alongside the future king and future queen may have been viewed as a way of preserving a particular vision of royal continuity itself. Yet that interpretation creates another puzzle. Because institutions rarely operate through symbolism alone, behind every symbolic decision exists a practical reality. And that practical reality may help explain why the story continued attracting attention inside royal circles. Several commentators have pointed out that the modern monarchy faces a challenge previous generations rarely encountered. Public visibility has become inseparable from institutional relevance. Historic collections hidden from public view gradually lose their ability to reinforce historical continuity. Objects that once connected generations can eventually become little more than private possessions. From that perspective, heirlooms are not merely artifacts. They are communication tools. They remind the public that today's monarchy exists within a much longer historical narrative. That may explain why some observers interpreted the reported decision as an effort to preserve accessibility rather than exclusivity. If certain pieces remain associated with active senior royals, they continue appearing at state occasions, diplomatic events, and historic ceremonies. Their stories remain visible. The alternative creates uncertainty. Because once objects disappear into private ownership, their public role often disappears with them. What remains unclear is whether this concern genuinely influenced the reported discussions or whether outside observers are reading too much into limited information. That uncertainty remains important. After all, perception and reality are not always the same thing. Yet even uncertainty can reveal something significant. The fact that so many analysts immediately interpreted the story through the lens of succession, continuity, and institutional strategy suggests that broader concerns were already present before the inheritance reports emerged. In other words, the story may have gained traction because it connected to questions people were already asking. Questions about leadership, questions about preparation, questions about the future identity of the monarchy, and perhaps most importantly, questions about trust. Trust remains one of the least discussed yet most valuable assets any royal institution possesses. Unlike authority, it cannot be inherited automatically. Unlike protocol, it cannot be enforced. It must be earned continuously. Several royal watchers have argued that the increasing attention surrounding Catherine reflects this reality. Public trust, once established, tends to attract institutional significance. Not because institutions deliberately create that outcome, but because confidence naturally influences perceptions of responsibility. If so, the reported preference begins to look less like an isolated decision and more like a reflection of larger forces already operating beneath the surface. For some observers, that interpretation explains almost everything. For others, it explains very little, because one crucial question still remains unanswered. Even if continuity, symbolism, and public trust all played a role, why did this discussion reportedly become sensitive enough to generate concern among multiple royal households? That question points toward a deeper issue, one that has received surprisingly little attention until now. The real significance may not lie in who was chosen. It may lie in how different people inside the institution interpreted what that choice appeared to mean. And according to several royal commentators, those differing interpretations could reveal a much larger conversation unfolding behind palace walls, a conversation not about jewels, inheritance, or even individual personalities, but about competing visions of what the monarchy should become in the decades ahead. If that assessment is even partially accurate, then everything discussed so far may represent only the outer layer of a far more consequential story, one whose most revealing implications have yet to fully emerge. If competing visions of the monarchy were quietly influencing how people interpreted the reported decision, then the story had clearly moved beyond questions of inheritance. What increasingly concerned royal commentators was the possibility that multiple pressures were beginning to converge at exactly the same moment. Individually, each pressure appeared manageable. Together, however, they were creating a situation that many observers believe could shape perceptions of the institution for years to come. One reason for this growing attention was the noticeable shift in how conversations surrounding the Princess of Wales were being framed. Earlier discussions often focused on public engagements, charitable work, and ceremonial responsibilities. More recently, analysts began speaking about something far larger. Increasingly, Catherine was being discussed not simply as a senior royal, but as a future stabilizing force whose importance extended beyond any individual role or title. That change in perception carried consequences, because once an individual becomes associated with institutional stability, every decision connected to them acquires additional meaning. Actions that might once have attracted limited attention suddenly become subjects of wider interpretation. Symbolic gestures become strategic signals. Routine developments become evidence in a much larger conversation. And according to several royal watchers, that transformation was already underway. What made the situation particularly significant was the reaction it appeared to generate among different observers. Some viewed the reported preference as a natural recognition of the princess's growing importance. Others saw it as something potentially more complicated, arguing that any perceived shift in symbolic influence inevitably raises questions about balance within the wider institution. Not because anyone's formal position changes, but because perception itself can become a source of influence. That distinction may explain why the story continued expanding long after the initial reports emerged. The discussion was no longer focused on what had allegedly been decided. Instead, attention shifted toward what people believed the decision implied. And implications often carry greater consequences than decisions themselves. Several analysts pointed out that royal institutions depend heavily upon clarity. The public understands who occupies which position. Protocol establishes hierarchy. Tradition reinforces structure. Yet stories, such as this, create an unusual challenge because they operate in the space between official reality and public interpretation. The official structure remains unchanged. the interpretation continues evolving. That gap creates uncertainty, and uncertainty tends to attract attention. As debate intensified, another pattern began emerging. Observers noticed that discussions surrounding the future king and future queen were becoming increasingly interconnected with discussions about long-term institutional continuity. What had once seemed like separate conversations gradually started merging into a single question: who will ultimately define the next chapter of the monarchy? At first glance, that question may appear premature. King Charles III remains firmly established as monarch, and the constitutional framework of succession remains entirely clear. Yet institutions often think beyond immediate circumstances. Planning rarely begins when change arrives. Planning begins years before change becomes necessary. That reality may help explain why some commentators viewed the reported inheritance discussion through a strategic lens rather than an emotional one. If future transitions are already influencing internal thinking, then preserving continuity becomes more than a ceremonial objective. It becomes an institutional priority, and priorities inevitably shape decisions. What remains unclear, however, is whether everyone interprets continuity in exactly the same way. That uncertainty introduces a new layer to the story, because continuity can mean preserving tradition. It can also mean adapting tradition. The difference between those two approaches may appear subtle, but within long-standing institutions it can become highly significant. Some royal commentators have suggested that one of the defining challenges facing the modern monarchy involves balancing historical identity with contemporary expectations. Too much change risks weakening tradition. Too little change risks weakening relevance. Navigating between those pressures requires constant adjustment. That balancing act creates pressure for everyone involved, not only for senior royals carrying public responsibilities, but also for those quietly considering how future generations will inherit the institution itself. Seen through that lens, the reported decision begins to look less like a private preference and more like part of a broader conversation concerning stewardship. Who protects history? Who carries institutional memory forward? Who can preserve public trust while maintaining continuity? These questions have no simple answers, yet they increasingly appear to sit beneath every discussion surrounding the story. Then another consequence emerged. Several analysts noted that public reaction itself was beginning to influence the narrative. Every new interpretation generated further debate. Every debate encouraged additional scrutiny. Every layer of scrutiny produced fresh questions about motivations, priorities, and future intentions. The story was becoming self-sustaining, not because new facts were constantly emerging, but because the implications continued expanding. In many ways, that expansion revealed something important about modern royal coverage. Audiences are often less interested in events than in what those events appear to signify. They look for patterns. They search for meaning. They try to understand how individual developments connect to larger institutional realities. And increasingly, many believe they were witnessing exactly such a connection. What began as a discussion about heirlooms had evolved into a discussion about influence. What began as a question about inheritance had evolved into a question about legacy. What began as speculation about personal preference had evolved into a conversation about the monarchy's future direction. That progression helps explain why the story refused to fade. Yet perhaps the most significant consequence had not fully emerged. Because as these interpretations continued circulating, attention gradually shifted toward another issue that had remained largely in the background until now. Several royal commentators began asking whether the reactions themselves were more revealing than the reported decision that caused them. In other words, perhaps the most important question was no longer why the preference allegedly existed. Perhaps the more revealing question was why so many people appeared concerned about what that preference represented. And if concerns were indeed developing behind the scenes, then they pointed toward pressures extending far beyond symbolism, inheritance, or public perception alone. They pointed toward something far more consequential: the challenge of managing expectations during a period when the monarchy is simultaneously preserving its past, operating in the present, and preparing for an increasingly scrutinized future. That possibility changes the entire framework of the story, because if multiple pressures, competing interpretations, public expectations, institutional priorities, and future planning are all converging around the same issue, then the reported decision may not be the central development after all. It may simply be the point at which a much larger process finally became visible. And according to some observers, the next stage of that process could force a reassessment of everything discussed so far, raising questions whose implications reach well beyond individual relationships and directly into the future identity of the monarchy itself. If the reported decision became a focal point for so many discussions, it was not because royal observers suddenly developed a new interest in heirlooms. It was because the story appeared to illuminate something that is usually hidden from public view. Beneath the ceremonies, titles, and carefully managed appearances lies a constant institutional question that every monarchy must eventually confront. How does one generation prepare the next to carry forward an institution that is older than any individual within it? That question may be the real reason this story matters. Throughout the discussion, attention often returned to jewelry because jewelry provided a visible symbol. Yet symbols only matter when they represent something larger. In this case, many analysts believe the larger issue concerns stewardship, not ownership, not status. Stewardship, who will carry certain traditions forward, who will preserve connections between past and future, who will maintain public trust during periods of transition. These questions extend far beyond any single decision. They speak directly to how the monarchy understands its own future. Several royal commentators have suggested that one of the most significant developments of recent years has been the gradual emergence of a new generation of leadership. This transition is not marked by constitutional change. It is marked by shifting expectations. As public attention increasingly focuses on Prince William and Catherine, observers naturally begin evaluating what kind of monarchy may eventually emerge under their stewardship. That process creates pressures that are often invisible. Every appearance is examined for meaning. Every decision is analyzed for significance. Every symbolic gesture becomes part of a larger narrative. What makes the current moment especially interesting is that the institution appears to be balancing multiple responsibilities simultaneously. It must preserve continuity while demonstrating relevance. It must respect tradition while adapting to changing expectations. It must honor its past while preparing for its future. Those objectives do not always align perfectly. In fact, some analysts argue that managing those competing demands may be one of the monarchy's greatest modern challenges. Viewed through that lens, the reported inheritance discussion begins to look less like an isolated development and more like a reflection of broader institutional realities. It reveals how closely questions of legacy have become intertwined with questions of leadership. And leadership itself may be the most important theme running through this entire story. Not leadership in the formal sense of titles and positions. Leadership in the sense of responsibility. The responsibility to preserve trust. The responsibility to maintain continuity. The responsibility to ensure that future generations inherit something stable rather than something uncertain. Many royal watchers believe that this responsibility increasingly defines public perceptions of Catherine. Whether appearing at state occasions, representing the crown internationally, or carrying out public engagements, she is often viewed through the lens of future leadership. That perception may explain why discussions surrounding her role frequently attract attention disproportionate to the specific events being discussed. People are not simply evaluating the present. They are imagining the future, and future expectations can be remarkably powerful forces. At the same time, the story also reveals something important about the nature of influence inside long-established institutions. Formal authority remains essential, but influence often emerges from less tangible sources. Reputation, trust, consistency, public confidence. These qualities cannot be assigned. They develop over time. Several commentators have noted that institutions often place their greatest confidence in individuals who demonstrate those qualities repeatedly over many years. If that observation helps explain some of the interpretations surrounding the reported decision, it also helps explain why reactions became so significant. Because reactions reveal priorities. They reveal concerns. They reveal what people believe is at stake. And increasingly, what appears to be at stake is not merely a collection of historic treasures, but the preservation of institutional confidence during a period of gradual transition. That realization transforms the entire story. What initially appeared to concern inheritance now appears connected to continuity. What appeared to concern symbolism now appears connected to responsibility. What appeared to concern individuals now appears connected to the future direction of the monarchy itself. Yet perhaps the most revealing aspect of the story is the way it highlights the difference between power and legacy. Power operates in the present. Legacy operates across generations. Power concerns immediate decisions. Legacy concerns how those decisions are remembered. Some observers believe that distinction may ultimately explain why stories like this resonate so strongly with royal audiences. People are not merely interested in what happens. They are interested in what events reveal about larger historical movements already underway. And there are signs that such a movement may indeed be taking shape. Across royal commentary, increasing attention is being devoted to questions of long-term succession planning, public trust, and institutional resilience. These discussions are not driven by crisis. Rather, they reflect a recognition that preparation itself is becoming one of the defining themes of the modern monarchy. Preparation for future leadership, preparation for future expectations, preparation for future challenges. In that context, even relatively small developments can acquire extraordinary significance because they offer glimpses into how senior figures may be thinking about the decades ahead. Of course, uncertainty remains. Reports differ. Interpretations vary. Motivations remain largely private. As with many royal stories, complete clarity may never emerge. Yet that uncertainty does not diminish the importance of what has been revealed. If anything, it reinforces it, because the enduring value of this story may not lie in confirming a particular decision. Its value may lie in what the discussion itself exposes about the monarchy's evolving priorities. It reveals an institution increasingly focused on continuity. It reveals growing attention toward future leadership. It reveals the importance of public trust as a foundation for long-term stability. And perhaps most importantly, it reveals how questions of legacy continue to shape decisions even in an era defined by constant change. By now, the immediate situation may appear clearer than it did at the beginning. The reported inheritance preference, whether viewed symbolically or strategically, seems far less important than the broader themes it brought into focus. Duty, continuity, stewardship, public confidence. These are the ideas that continue echoing beneath the surface of the story. And that may ultimately be why royal observers have paid such close attention. Because stories involving the royal family are rarely remembered for the events themselves. They are remembered for what those events reveal about larger transformations taking place over time. The question, then, is no longer whether one reported decision carried symbolic significance. The deeper question is whether future historians will look back on moments like this and see them as early indications of a monarchy quietly preparing for its next chapter. Was this simply a discussion about inheritance and legacy, or was it an early sign of how the institution is positioning itself for the future that lies beyond the current generation? Only time will provide the answer. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the royal family, Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, King Charles III, Princess, and the future of the monarchy, be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our next royal analysis. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'll see you in the next video.